had joined a small surveying party in the high hollows of the Appalachian Ridge in the autumn of 1872, mapping timber and prospecting for coal with chain, plane table, and pocket compass. That night, our instruments and our courage proved inadequate to explain what broke the valley's silence. We were 5 men sent by the county to lay out a stretch of ridge and hollow in western Appalachia. 2 chainmen, Harris and Little, a topographer named Beaumont, who kept a retractable plane table strapped to his breast, a mule driver called Jonas, and myself. Our pack mules walked in a line like a slow prayer, each pannier wrapped in oilcloth against the drizzle and cold. We carried a Gunter's chain, a stout pocket compass, spare needles, tallow candles, a bottle of spirits for the lamp, and my leather-bound field book in which I copied bearings and trees by lamplight beneath a tin lantern each evening. The work was plain and honest. We measured timber lines, paced out the coal seams as Beaumont sighted from the higher benches, and set stakes where geography and ledger required them. The chainman struck the heel pin and sang out the Count Harris. Taller manhandled the chain, Little watched the plumb, and Beaumont drew the angles upon his plane table with a steady, inked rule. I kept the daily tally: bays of chestnut blight, bluffs of shale, the locus of a small run where the coal seam showed a black edge. The compass gave bearings that were invariably skewered by the magnetics of the ridge we learned to cross by sun and notch, to trust the horizon more than the needle when the cloud lay low. Autumn came with thin frost that mornings, and the smell of wood smoke that evening. The hollows held a damp breath. We made camp on a shelf of broken shale beneath a stand of short oaks and set the lantern upon a flat stone. Jonas tended the mules and salted a bit of pork, while Beaumont set the plane table and tested the retracting arm. Harris cleaned the chain. Little read back the day's distances aloud in a voice grown smaller than the wind, and I copied the numbers into my book by lamplight, the nib leaving dark marks that shone when I tilted the page toward the flame. Around the second night, the ridge settled into a hush, broken only by our small noises: the scrape of a boot, the rustle of oilcloth, the soft chew of a mule. I remember the cold pressing its fingers into the lantern glass and the sound of distant water running like a silver thread. It was after supper, after the lines had been drawn and the day's entry sealed with a smudge of wax, when the first sound came. We had all paused in our tasks. The sound rolled from the hollow like the beginning of a chiming, but not like any chime I had known. It rose in a long, mournful note, and then fell into a succession of cries that were too high, too brittle for bear, and too low for fox. It carried with a strange clarity, as if the very air had been tuned to let it pass. Jonas hollered softly. "What manner of hound is that?" Harris spat and swore it was a wandering dog, until the sound returned and made his words seem childish. Beaumont put a hand to his plane table as one might steady a vessel in bad seas. The mules bristled and stamped, showing the whites of their eyes in the lantern glow. Little, who had spent his life on ridges, crossed himself without speaking. We listened to the valley answer with echoes that came back altered, lengths and harmonics that made my teeth ache. I rose and fetched the pocket compass out of my coat, not because I trusted it, but because a man will handle what he knows when confronted with what he does not. The needle trembled, and then fixed our bearings lay unchanged, our camp unshifted, yet the sound moved as if it were living among the trees. Then, for a moment between two notes, I thought I caught pale movement upon the next rise, a smear of something light against the darker trunks, not the glint of eyes, but of hide that took the moon oddly. I cannot say I saw its head or its limbs clearly. The lantern threw a small cone of light, and that cone did not reach it. We did not speak plainly of that sight. Beaumont tightened a screw on his plane table, and, in the small and precise voice he used for measurements, suggested we keep the lamp shielded and listen for changes in tempo and pitch. Harris fetched another mooring for the chain, and Little began to wind the tape upon its spool as though preparing for an immediate survey. Jonas fed the mules an extra handful of oats and set them close to the pack saddle. I opened the leather-bound field book to lay down the night entry and hesitated, my pen hovering, while that sound rose again from the hollow. A note that was not bear nor hound, which threaded through the trees and stopped us, all of us, with our hands upon the known things. The valley listened. We listened. And then, when the cry came clear and nearer, I closed the book and let the ink dry on the page, not willing to name what followed. I cannot say when the unease hardened into purpose. Perhaps it was the way the men checked the chain and the compass with fingers that did not obey, or the way Harlan laughed without humor. We had eaten from the camp kettle, salt pork and hardtack, and boiled coffee in a tin pot. The canvas tent was pegged, the gunter's chain coiled at the horse's halter, and the plane table lashed to a young sapling. We kept the surveyor's compass and field book within the tent's mouth, as men who meant to work at first light. Moonrise came through hemlock boughs slow. Mist pooled in the hollows like cold breath. The logger at the last trading post had warned us of a strange cry heard up the ridge at moonrise. The men joked as we set the fire, but the jokes were short and without heat. At the first drawn moon, the cry came. It rose from the ridge above us, a single long wail that neither matched the hounds nor the foxes I had heard. It carried an inverted cadence, high and thin, and it hung between trees like smoke. The pack horse pricked his ears and shuddered. Harlan set down his tin cup and said, "Devil or dog." No one laughed. We searched the margin of the lantern light, pushing beams over trunks and into rhododendron thickets. The mist swallowed the glow. At the edge of the light, a shape moved, paler than bark, slender and larger than a fox. It stepped with an awkward deliberation, as if measuring gaps between sapling and stone. When it halted, it turned its head toward us. The lantern slipped from my hand. There was no plain face, only two bright slits that caught the light, and a paleness where fur or skin might have been bleached. Moss, the youngest, laughed and stepped from the maples to throw a stick. The stick struck nothing. The creature answered with a long, low sound that shook leaves. Then I saw the prints, pressed into damp moss around the fire. They were larger than a man's foot, splayed with blunt impressions suggesting long claws. The prints circled about 5 yards from the tent, and then ran up the slope toward the ridge, as if the maker had paced us and selected a watch. We fired twice into the air. The rifles thundered and the hollow stilled. The cry returned, nearer now, seeming to answer from the very edge of camp. We found tufts of pale hair snagged on rhododendron branches, fine as spun wool and colder than the night. Harlan swore softly. No man spoke of abandoning the survey, but work felt suddenly fragile, an arrangement of pins and paper before something patient and large. We set watches. I took the first, sitting with my back to the plane table, hand on the gunter's chain, listening to the wood breathe and my own breath. At times, I told myself naturalists could name the noises. A lone wolf, a sick bear, an old buck. Yet the hair at my neck lifted, for the cry bore an afterpulse like a voice learning to sound hollow. Moss took a lantern and followed the prince up the slope until the mist took him. The air closed in his footfalls, became indistinguishable from the answering call. I called his name, and he did not answer. By dawn, we had marked the tree line and noted where the prince ran into the scrub. We were 3 days' work from the nearest trading post. Turning back would have cost months of labor and hungry creditors. Still, none of us slept. Noon closed the sky, and rain threaded the boughs. That afternoon, while we tended the plane table, a single long call floated down the hollow and stopped us all. It was nearer than before. We shouldered instruments and climbed the ridge toward the sound, ropes and chain in hand, plane table set ready ahead. Before the full moon rose, we found concrete signs, tufts of pale hair snagged on a beech sapling, elongated impressions pressed into the clay of a stream bank, and a bent tripod where our theodolite had been knocked down during an interrupted observation. My pocket compass wavered over a seam of magnetite along the ridge, and the mule driver swore the animal shied at a sound like no known beast. We set the chain and tape across the ridge, noting bearings and putting down stakes as protocol required. But the ordinary rhythm of our work felt undermined by attention from somewhere unseen. I remember instructing Jameson to record the azimuth twice, and to take the vernier reading. As I righted the instrument, the brass smelled of grease and iron, and would not sit true until I dug the tripod feet into firmer ground. When I crouched to steady it, the mule stamped. The driver cursed softly, and from down the hollow there came a low, extended note that lifted the hair along my forearm, though no wind moved the leaves. We followed the bank impressions where the clay had been pressed and slid into ovals, far larger than a hound's track, elongated and marked at one end as if by a scraping motion. The tufts of pallid hair were wiry and coarse. They felt colder to the touch than hair should amid the warm autumn air. I wrapped a sample in my handkerchief and stowed it in the instrument case. We had no microscope, only a small bottle of collodion for photography. Yet common prudence is a thing that survives the shortness of a survey. Abel, the mule driver, refused to set his beast within sight of the beach, saying the creature smelled of old bone and spring water, words he repeated to steady his voice. He had driven pack animals through Allegheny hollows and knew the shriek of panther as well as any backwoodsman that his account differed was cause for unease. By midnight, the cloudscape shifted. The moon had not yet cleared the eastern oaks, and a white mist lay like a shroud in the valley. We banked the fire to coals, wrapped our oilcloth and wool about us, and took turns at the watch, the small party huddled to conserve warmth and to keep count of time. Our stores were modest: salted pork, hardtack, a small ham of cheese, biscuits, a keg of spirits, and our instruments: chain, tape, plumb bob, compass, and the brass theodolite. Every so often I consulted my pocket compass each time the needle trembled as if uncertain, the magnetite seam beneath the ridge drawing it off true. We moved by measured rods the following day, following contour and grade, and twice we found fresh notches where saplings had been split and rubbed flat, as if a large hand had sought purchase. The theodolite's tripod groaned. The second morning, one leg bore a fresh bend that Jameson said he had not seen when he set up before fetching the chain. We searched the loam for furrows or blood, but found only more hair and long linear impressions, grooves like the path of something that slid as it travelled. That evening, while mapping a knoll, a sound rose from the northern ledge, a long keening that bent and folded, neither the wolf's full-throated howl nor any hound's cry I had heard in frontier camps. It circled the camp twice as if inspecting us, and then fell away into the hollows. Abel dropped his lantern and it guttered, a brief, bright absence of light. I felt the metallic taste of fear, and yet the training of years took hold. I lifted the instrument and obtained an azimuth toward the sound, in the hope that the record might later serve explanation. Jameson read the degree aloud. The men stood rigid, and we made no attempt to pursue in the dark, for mules balk and chains are lost. The rifle had hardly finished its bark when the hollow answered. 2 notes, farther now, as if the speaker had retreated, and yet had not left the clearing. Lantern glow trembled on the laurel, and on our faces, the kerosene lamp at my hip smelled of smoke and cold oil. I remember the sting of the night air, the wet leaves clinging to my leggings, and the sour iron taste at the back of my mouth where adrenaline had made me bite my tongue. We fanned out without words. The planetable lay abandoned where it had been upended by the scramble that alidade, slipped from a hastily released clamp, scraped the earth. My chain, a gunter's chain coiled in its leather case, rattled as I drew it free to mark a measure and, for the moment, steady my nerves. My men had Sharp's rifles, and a brace of Colt's cartridges were counted by the light of the lamp. We struck flint from habit, and from the old military caution that never leaves a man who has kept a camp on the frontier. There were signs at once. A branch, cleanly broken and peeled of its inner bark, lay on the trail where the pale shape had crossed. The undergrowth bore the drag of something that moved swift and low. No cloven hoof, no 4-foot drag, but impressions set wider than any horse or mule I knew. I set the heel of my boot within one shallow depression. To compare it almost swallowed me. It was nearly twice the length of my brogans, and the stride between marks measured by eye far longer than a man's. The print's edges were rounded, as if the ground had given under a much weightier tread, and along the side of one imprint there stuck a pale film of hair, fine and silvery in the lantern light. Hayes, who held the planetable, knelt and traced the impression with a careful forefinger, his surveyor's instinct doing what training and fear would not, recording rather than imagining. He measured the gap between prints with a twig and muttered the number to himself. 19, 20 feet, he said at last, and I had to laugh, though it was a brittle sound. The laurel's leaves carried a faint, sour scent, like fox and old thunder, but beneath that was something colder, almost the clean smell of iron and wet stone, as if the thing had come from a place where frost lingered even in June. We followed the marks into the tangle, the lanterns bobbing, boots sinking in moss. Once the cry rose again from the ridge, fuller this time, a keening that bent up and away like a rope thrown toward the moon. The dogs that trailed with us flattened their ears and whimpered. One old hound bolted for the tree line, only to balk at the dark beyond. For a man who spends his life measuring the world, the sudden immensity of unknown things is a poor companion. At the edge of a small clearing, we found a torn scrap of canvas, part of a pack saddle, velveteen, where it had been clawed or dragged. The pack mule's halter had been snapped where a good iron bite would have held it. Two of our lesser tools were gone, an iron pick and a canteen. There was no blood to mark the place, only the disturbance of things that had been laid aside with order. We called Hargrove, who had gone toward the ridge with his lantern, and he answered from above with a voice that trembled. He had seen tracks go up a steep, laurel-choked draw, and then stop at a place where the root system formed a small cave. He swore he had seen for a second a pale contour against the moon, limbs folded like some gaunt ape, then an ocular flash like reflected light before it snowed away among leaves. We made a circlet and set watches. Nobody spoke of running. Instead, we fell to the small practical ministrations of men at work under strain, oiling locks, replenishing primers, relighting the lanterns with hands that did not quite stop shaking. I wrote 3 lines in the field book from memory and tried to make them plain. June 1872. Ridge north of Dry Hollow. Strange call. Prints. Large. Pack damaged. It felt inadequate. All night the keening came and went, sometimes distant, sometimes so near that the hairs along my forearm prickled as if a hand had brushed them. At one turn, the sound made Hayes mutter a prayer under his breath. He was a man of a steady faith. And Hargrove, who had once seen a cougar on the Allegheny Ridges in '69, said aloud that no known creature he had hunted gave such a cry. We drew closer still to what we could follow into the brush, and the marks led us to an old logging road that fell away toward the hollow. There the prints crossed and disappeared beneath a mossy ledge. We held our rifles ready, and the lamps glow humble and small against the dark. We could not tell then whether the thing had turned aside, or whether it had waited for us to go on. I remember thinking of every instrument we carried, the alidade, the chain, the compass needle that still quivered in its box, and I remember the resolve that settled over us like the cold dew. At first light, we would follow the line down the old road into the hollow. The moon moved to the west, and the last cry that night rose like a question without answer, sent up the ridgeline, and was not answered by any human voice. We fled at first light with a ruined pack and a mule missing its saddle. The topographer's field book bore a smear where ink had stopped mid-entry, and one chainman left the trade thereafter, his hands trembling whenever we spoke of that ridge. My own report to the county clerk was met with polite disbelief, but the name the locals gave it, the Pale Howler, lived on in whispered warnings, and the hollow kept its secret. A night in 1872, when surveyors with compasses and chains could only record a howl and a vanished figure on their ledger pages. We had gone into little, hollow to run a boundary line, simple work by the standards of the district. Bearings taken by a brass compass, a 66-foot Gunter's chain, pegs and stakes, a penny lamp for low light, and the topographer's quill kept oiled in a tin. Our provisions were plain: hardtack, salted pork, coffee in a cloth bag, and 2 small flasks to warm joints on damp nights. The mule had carried our packs without complaint until that slope where the trees opened and the hollow yawned like a wound. The evening was warm with rain gone, an hour before the ground gave a wet scent that rose and lay about us. We set a small fire, checked knots and the chain, tightened the mule's girth. The topographer made his last entry as the penny lamp guttered. I can still see the curl of his hand closing the book and the smear where the ink ceased. It began with a sound like a distant wolf, but stretched and hollow, carrying up from the bowl of the hollow and scraping among branches. We listened. The topographer folded his hands around the book. One chainman laid his palm upon the Gunter's chain and did not speak. I stepped to the lip to peer down into shadow. something pale moved along the farther slope. Not an animal in the way we understood animals. Upright, long-limbed, stealing over logs with a baleful economy. At first, it was a lighter patch. Then it raised a head that was too narrow, a face I could not name, and gave a cry that set the marrow cold. It was a note deep and drawn like a trombone, and a wolf at once, and it answered the silence with a sequence as if it counted us. I fired one shot into where the pail had been. The report answered in an emptiness. Leaves trembled, and a stillness rushed in like a closing door. The topographer's last line on the open page broke, and the ink bled into a dark blot. The letters finished no sentence. The mule, startled, bolted, and later we found its saddle abandoned upon a rock shelf below. We retreated by compass and the sliver of moon, boots slipping in damp leaf mold, each man keeping the other by touch more than talk. We walked without sleeping until the lane opened and a tavern sign offered light and stew. The chainman who had marked the far end of the line would not take up surveying again. He worked stables, and he would flinch at night when a hound bayed. I filed the formal notes at County Hall, listing stations, bearings and distances with the care a clerk expected. The field book, its final pages smeared, I kept folded in my chest for years. Men who had sat a lifetime on porches nodded and dismissed the tale the older women crossed themselves and said the hollow had its own reckonings. Boys were told to keep away from that ridge after sundown. Sometimes at night, when the wind comes down through the pines, I think I hear that counting cry, and I set my hand upon the field book out of habit. The line we failed to close remains a blank among the county measures, an omission that speaks if one listens for the hollows, slow, deliberate breath. Still,